Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 18th week of 2014. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion on the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and Ron Szoke. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, quote, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories that have been ignored or misreported, occasionally even innocently, and then having our colleagues comment on them. Today is May 2nd. On this day 3 years ago, Osama bin Laden, the suspected mastermind behind the September 11, 2001 attacks, was killed by United States Special Forces in Abbottabad, Pakistan. It's increasingly clear that the operation was a planned assassination, multiply violating elementary norms of international law. There appears to have been no attempt to apprehend the unarmed victim, as presumably could have been done by 90 heavily armed Special Operations commandos facing virtually no opposition, except a claim from his wife, who lunged towards them. In societies that profess some respect for law, suspects are apprehended and brought to a fair trial. I stress suspects. In April of 2002, the head of the FBI, Robert Mueller, informed the press that after the most intensive investigation in history, the FBI could say no more than it believed that the plot was hatched in Afghanistan, though implemented in the UAE and Germany, the 9/11 plot. What they only believed in April 2002, they obviously didn't know 8 months earlier, when Washington dismissed tentative offers by the Taliban, how serious we don't know because they were instantly dismissed, to extradite bin Laden if they were presented with evidence, which, as we soon learned, Washington didn't have. Thus, Obama was simply lying when he said in his White House statement that, quote, we quickly learned that the 9/11 attacks were carried out by al-Qaeda, close quote. There's also much meaty discussion of Washington's anger that Pakistan didn't turn over bin Laden, though surely elements of the military and security forces were aware of his presence in Abbottabad. Less is said about Pakistani anger that the U.S. invaded their territory to carry out a political assassination. Anti-American fervor is already very high in Pakistan, and these events are likely to exacerbate it. The decision to dump the body at sea was already predictably provoking both anger and skepticism in much of the Muslim world. We might ask ourselves how we would be reacting if Iraqi commandos landed at George W. Bush's compound, assassinated him, and dumped his body in the Atlantic. Uncontroversially, his crimes vastly exceeded bin Laden's, and he is not a suspect, but uncontroversially, the decider who gave the orders to commit, quote, the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole, to borrow the language from the Nuremberg Triangle, for which Nazi criminals were hanged. The hundreds of thousands of deaths, millions of refugees, destruction of much of the country of Iraq, the bitter sectarian conflict that has now spread to the rest of the region and continues to intensify in Iraq, all of that George Bush was uncontroversially responsible for. The Obama administration called the assassination of bin Laden Operation Geronimo. The imperial mentality is so profound throughout Western society that no one can perceive that they're glorifying bin Laden, by identifying with the courageous resistance against genocidal invaders, as was led by the historic Geronimo. It's like naming our murder weapons after victims of our crimes: Apache, Tomahawk. It's as if the Luftwaffe were to call its fighter planes Jew and Gypsy. There's much more to say, but even the most obvious elementary facts should provide us with a good deal to think about and a different appreciation of the events of 3 years ago today than is absolutely common throughout the American media. You're listening to News from Neptune, the Obama Revenge edition, and Ron Szoke will land in our compound.
Yes. I wanted to start with this book that I came across a good copy of just a few days ago. I'd heard about it months ago, perhaps from you guys, I think. Mike Davis, Planet of Slums. I'm just getting into it, but it's absolutely hair-raising and frightening. What he's talking about is a phenomenon of the slums, the shanty towns, the favelas that are surrounding more and more of the major cities of the globe. A prime example in the Western Hemisphere is Mexico City. About approximately 20 million people have come together in this area around central Mexico. The same thing is happening in China. There are massive conurbations building there. I'm told that this is happening in many other countries. Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, you name it, any large city will be surrounded by this ring of whatever you call them, shanty towns typically. We saw that in South Africa. Sometimes they're isolated into Bantustans. Sometimes it's not that formal and official. My wife tells me that this is happening even around Moscow now. All these people, impoverished country people, moving in to the city, hoping to find jobs there and to improve their lives in that way, and typically becoming very disappointed. So how do they exist or subsist? Typically by, well, many ways. Mr. Davis says that there are hundreds of little entrepreneurs in these areas who exist by selling things that they've stolen or picked up from trash heaps and so on. Indeed, there are some absolutely hair-raising documentaries online about the people who live by going through the trash heaps around these big cities, finding things that are still usable and then selling them. It's like perpetual hundreds of little garage sales all around these massive cities. And then, of course, there is prostitution and drug dealing, and it's become notorious in some places. The upcountry girls who are taken into Bangkok to work in the bordellos there. Many examples of this. How do these people exist at all? It's amazing, the ingenuity with which they tackle this problem. So there's this whole class that I've commented on before, the so-called precariat, people who have jobs, part-time, intermittently, that we see all around us today without realizing the situation that they're in and their potential for making trouble for the more affluent. An aspect of their life that is stressed in this book by Guy Standing, the precariat, the new dangerous class, drawing upon a slogan that was used about the English working class in the 19th century. They were called the dangerous class because it was feared that they would not only victimize the more affluent, but maybe eventually rise up and invade the areas of the more affluent and prosperous people in the late British Empire. But how do people make a living? So I started thinking about this, looking at it. Some of the new ways that have been suggested in our own society is investing in lawsuits. There are certain lawsuits that you can buy into, and if the person loses their lawsuit, you will lose your money, but if they win, you may be able to win an enormous bonanza. And the lawyers who work on a contingency fee are already into this to some extent, but it's been opened up now to a lot of other people. So if you are going to sue somebody for whatever, defamation or carelessness or whatever, somebody might be willing to buy a piece of your lawsuit in the hope of making a big amount of money if you win the lawsuit. Another one that we're hearing more about is those who invest in the career earnings of students. If you think you see a particularly promising student who may accomplish a good deal in their subsequent professional life, you can buy a piece of them by paying for their college expenses and working out a contract by which you get a certain percentage of their earnings over the next 10 years after they graduate. So our student loan arrangement now is already doing something like that. And there's an enormous amount of money at stake there. The student loan debt in this country is absolutely overwhelming, far beyond what a lot of people seem to realize.
Far beyond even credit card debt.
Yeah. So there are other kind of contingency loans that are available. It's a form of gambling, and but people, especially poor people, desperate people, are notoriously vulnerable to this kind of thing. It's those people who buy the lottery tickets, typically not rich people by any means, or affluent, or people, comfortable people. It's those who live in the hope of striking it big one day by buying the right lottery ticket. If you're on the other end of the social scale from the big rich, the comfortable, the affluent, and so on, apparently there's something else going on in this town. I haven't investigated it personally that much yet. You can sell your blood for apparently plasma for $35 an occasion. Have you known anyone or seen anyone doing this?
Yes.
Yeah. The blood platelets for $50, but you can do that only every 2 weeks, 24 times a year. You can sell your hair if it's over 10 inches long. You can sell your kidneys. That's not legal at present, but it goes on anyway, especially in these desperately poor areas. Sell them only one at a time, I assume. You can engage in clinical trials. You can become a volunteer to try out certain drugs that they want to know the effect of on people. This is often done to prisoners, but I don't know whether they have that much discretion about whether they are used in that way as guinea pigs, but it's one possibility. Maybe there's some bargaining with them that they will get remission of some of their prison time if they volunteer for these clinical trials. Sperm banks. This one is actually advertised online. How to accidentally have 150 kids and get paid for it. There's some interesting cases.
New movie.
Yeah, right. Like that. And of course, this website then includes going gigolo, fantasy of some males apparently. If you saw the movie Midnight Cowboy, looking up one of these escort places and offering your services to them. essentially being a male prostitute. So there's some of that going on too. So how do people cope? How do they survive? It's frightening and makes you, well, sometimes you have to have a certain admiration for their ingenuity in surviving in this kind of society. But I'm going to reference finally an article in the New York Times by Ann Lowry on April 30th. Changed life of the poor, better off but far behind. Is a family with a car in the driveway, a flat screen television, and a computer with an internet connection poor? Americans, even many of the poorest, enjoy a level of material abundance unthinkable just a generation or two ago. That indisputable economic fact has become a subject of bitter political debate this year, half a century after President Johnson declared a war on poverty. So in absolute terms, the poor, on average, are doing better. But in comparative terms, they're doing much worse. The more affluent people are pulling away from them steadily at an ever-increasing rate. But our right-wingers tell us that the very poor have never had it so good, and they should appreciate what they have and stop complaining. Without a doubt, the poor are far better off than they were at the dawn of the war on poverty, said James Ziliak, director of University of Kentucky Center for Poverty Research. But they have also drifted farther away. For many working poor families, the most apt description of their finances and lifestyle might be fragile or precarious, as I've called it in the past. Even with a steady paycheck, keeping the bills paid becomes a hire-wire act and saving an impossibility. Tammy Haggerty Noy, a 49-year-old living in Richmond, Virginia, tapped at an iPhone as she sat on the porch of her group home where she lives. Its proprietor is a friend of her daughter's. She earns $7.25 an hour at a local McDonald's and makes a little extra money on the side from planting small plots of land for neighbors who want to garden. She's trying to rebuild her finances, which have been decimated by divorce, government liens, and addiction. At the top of her list of priorities is finding a better paid work. She produced a paycheck that showed her earnings so far this year as $2,938. It's impossible, she said. Every cent of that goes towards what I need. A few months ago, she sold her car for $500 to make rent. And so it goes for an enormous number of people in this society who tend to remain invisible to those of us in the middle class. So there it is.
Thank you, Ron. Take on the precariat, David?
Well, Ron, you just don't believe in the free market, do you? So, yeah, I mean, all of these things, I mean, slavery made perfect sense. In economic terms, slavery made perfect sense. And slaves became commodities, they became credit, they became collateral, as referred to in the book that I spoke about a couple of weeks ago by Greg Grandin, The Empire of Necessity. So all of these things within a certain systematic way of thinking about capitalism and about what's called rational choice, all of these things make sense. But you sort of have to get outside the system and look and see what the system is actually doing. Certainly an important decision was made by the government of China in the 1970s to open China up to the global economy, what has become the neoliberal economy. And that has driven enormous numbers of people from rural China to work for the corporations that have been allowed to go into China and make their products. And that has been a huge influence on changing the entire world. But this is only the latest phase of this vast movement from rural areas to urban areas. It can be seen in rational terms in certain ways, but from another perspective, it's nuts. It's crazy. So we have to begin to understand what the difference between those two ways of looking at the world is, and how it is that these aren't really rational choices that people are given. The precariat is given very limited choices and the 1% justifies its choices in terms of the so-called free market, which becomes a kind of satire of itself when you talk about investing in students in debt.
Yeah.
Yeah. Remember the remark of from the Johnson War on Poverty, from the time of Johnson's War on Poverty, that the press for employment raised some serious questions. And of course, the employment statistics were much better in President Johnson's time than they are today. But as was said then, we had full employment under slavery. The system worked in that sense, and that's quite true. So the conditions of employment obviously need to be attended to. The conditions of full employment in the American antebellum South were not, in fact, ones that we applaud. And we sometimes, I think, perhaps overdo our historical cheerleading for the American Civil War that, quote, ended slavery, close quote. An important book by Douglas Blackman, who writes for the Wall Street Journal, who was writing for the Wall Street Journal at the time, came out a few years ago, about 5 years ago, called Slavery by Another Name, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. And this was, it was quite a shocking picture he painted of the conscious policies that has simply reproduced the conditions of employment, particularly of African Americans, from the antebellum South down to the time of the Second World War, and that in many ways it was only war production that finally produced jobs of a sort that employed a good number of these folks, and they led to the so-called golden age of capitalism between the end of the Second World War and a generation later. In the United States, the essentially only undamaged country to emerge from the Second World War. So the circumstances of employment are important. It's not just a question of being employed and being unemployed.
Yeah.
This morning there were numbers published showing a drop in the unemployment rate in this country from 6.7 to 6.3%. But as was immediately pointed out by folks who attend to how the government publishes those numbers, that resulted from people leaving the workforce, from people moving into situations such as Ron was just describing, where they're supporting themselves by something other than a decent job. Now look, we all know that one of the major reasons Barack Obama became president was his promise of hope and change, specifically his promise of jobs. The promise has in no way been carried out, and the administration has not been held to it. The peculiar quiescence of American workers in that regard was remarked on our Workers' May Day in this country, which of course is substituted here as Loyalty Day. So the questions, the very real questions that Ron raises from Mike Davis' Planet of Slums and from the notion of the precariat all come back home. I mean, the slums we might want to talk about include those around Detroit, and even Detroit as a whole. The U.S. is sending money to Ukraine, but not to Michigan. The slums around Baltimore, the slums around Philadelphia, the slums that are the inner cities of Philadelphia, all of this goes by the by because the American administration is working for the 1%.
The slums around Los Angeles, which did erupt in 1965, and did that put a scare into anyone?
Yeah, it sure did.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I recall. I mean, I was only 15 at the time, but it certainly. I mean, the typical reaction was that people in L.A. thought that Negroes, as they were called at that time, were doing a lot better in L.A. than they were doing in the South, where there was all this disturbance in the civil rights movement at that time. But of course, it revealed that it began to reveal what came obvious in subsequent years, that northern cities were doing a whole lot better.
Yeah. Do you have any sense of what's going on in Watts now, or is there unrest?
Not really. I think that'd be hard to it'd be hard to summarize it in a brief. It's not any better. I can't imagine that it's any better.
Some have said the American system is marvelously adaptive in introducing palliatives to prevent just that kind of boiling over at some point.
Yeah,
But it's not working everywhere.
Yeah.
You see, what puzzles me is what happened in Turkey on May Day.
They actually there was a fairly substantial demonstration.
Yes.
And they with specific reference to Workers' May Day. I mean, it was a workers' demonstration against the Erdogan government. The palliatives, I think, are exactly right. And, of course, the greatest palliative in this country right now for these matters is an African-American president whose job is to cover sin with smooth names, and he manages to do it. That's what recommended him for the job in the first place, and in that sense, he's carrying out the job quite nicely, thank you. You're watching News from Neptune. We'll press on. David, you have something you want to
Yeah,
bring
just
up today?
a couple of, I guess, somewhat related themes. One about L.A. and one about social class and so forth. The one that, it's hard to know which one to take first, but I have to get these things off my chest. Usually I don't come in to do this program in a very agitated state. It's Friday, and we're looking forward to the weekend, but it's been a particularly disturbing week for a couple of reasons, for many reasons. One has to do with this sort of related local brouhaha over an alleged anti-Semitic conference that took place almost anonymously last weekend in the midst of the marathon and Ebertfest, but it certainly has been noticed by at least a couple of people that there are some alleged relationships between anti-Semitism and the 9/11 Truth movement. And I have to relate this at a kind of sort of broader level of liberal sanctimoniousness. I have to relate all this to the alleged crimes of one Donald Sterling in Los Angeles, owner of the Los Angeles Clippers basketball team, who said some vile and naughty things about black people, none of which I can imagine he's liable to be criminally prosecuted for. If anything, his mistress is liable to be criminally prosecuted for publicizing what it was a private phone call. I don't know how this plays out legally. I do know that it arouses enormous amount of displaced liberal sanctimoniousness among the media, which isn't unrelated to the sort of sanctimoniousness we find locally about alleged anti-Semitism in the 9/11 Truth movement, in the context of those who never have a word to say in opposition to U.S. foreign policy in general or U.S. support for Israel in particular. So these particular sort of cultural, political pathologies need to be unraveled at some level. The other major topic I would address today briefly has to do with an editorial in today's News Gazette, which an editorial by the editors, rest in peace to the plan to have a graduated tax, a graduated income tax in this state, which is needed to very easily solve our budget deficit, which is a kind of a cooked deficit. It's a manufactured deficit. It results from having a flat income tax, too much dependence on what is obviously a flat sales tax, and just a whole system that is kind of constitutionally locked in, where the people cannot decide, even if the majority of people want it, the majority of people can't decide to have a graduated progressive income tax in which the rich people of this state, the rich 20%, 5%, 1%, who could easily afford to provide the extra $10 billion or so or less that we need to have a balanced budget in this state, would and many of whom would want that, in fact, to do so. So and this tax all of the effects of this state budget crisis in terms of having borrowed from the pension and what the consequences of that for the pension plan are. Our people around me are retiring like flies. Unfortunately, I'm not one of them because they're being forced to, because they're being told that if they don't retire, their pensions will be dramatically cut back. I mean, for the News Gazette editors, I mean, as predictable as it is, I cannot understand what it is, I naively assert, I cannot understand what it is about some people who are clearly capable of looking at the facts. We have a regressive tax system in the state where at state and local levels, wealthy people, poor people pay about 14% of their incomes, and wealthy people pay about 4% of their incomes to state and local taxes. And the data in the state context, in the national context, is very clear. I guess I'll just say one thing. From what I can tell from sort of making certain assumptions about the data, we have a $700 billion economy, GDP in this state. Probably about $200 billion of that is income, and income is more than earnings, but it's income for the upper 20% of the upper quintile. So out of that $200 billion of the $700 billion GDP, which is accounted for as income to the upper 20%, they probably don't pay more than 3 or 4% of that in state income taxes. That $200 billion, maybe if it were 4%, that would be $8 billion. They can well afford to pay another $8 billion of that $200 billion of their total income in order to balance the state budget. It could be easily done. It could be affordably done. It would help the economy because it would put money in the hands of the people who receive it through jobs with the state and through providing services to the state. These are not real problems. This isn't a matter of a spendthrift, whatever you say about the legislature. This isn't a matter of a spendthrift legislature. State government is pretty tight. I mean, I see it in the programs that I work with. We have to be accountable for every dollar. There isn't a whole lot of waste, and certainly no more waste than goes on in the corporate sector, by a long shot. So this is all just outrageous. This is all just nonsense. And I wrote an article about this, not even realizing that this state constitutional amendment thing was. I didn't even realize what the status of that was when I wrote this. It's just sort of been in my hopper to get something written about this. I wrote it. I sent it in on Sunday, and I heard from the News Gazette managing editor Dan Corkery that he'd like to run it if it were still an issue. But now that it's not an issue, now that it's been turned down, they're not going to run it.
Hey, we don't have any problems there anymore.
Yeah, no problems. So I'm going to I will turn it into a letter to, I will turn this 900-word piece into a 250-word letter to the editor, make my basic points. The full article I'll submit to the public eye, and you can read it there, or we can post it online or whatever. But the data is so clear about taxation and spending, and that we are not taxed enough, especially at the state and local level, to get what the people need. And I guess the final point is just something that I always think of Thomas Paine, the rights of man, where he talks about the past ruling the present, governing the present. Some people in the past passed a law in our Constitution saying you need a two-thirds majority to amend the Constitution. So we need 2/3 of the people to, representatives of the 2/3 of the state legislature to get this constitutional amendment, and it's anti-democratic and in quite the manner in which Thomas Paine talked about in his response to in the Rights of Man in response to Edmund Burke's criticism of the French Revolution. But that's taking us a little far afield.
Your take on this, Ron?
Yes, well, there's a recent book, I understand, which purports to be a direct confrontation between Burke and Thomas Paine, on just these points. What do you think of the point
yeah.
made by Burke and other conservatives
Yeah.
that all the dead people of the past deserve a vote too, and they think he thinks he knows how they would
I thought
vote?
that was just in Chicago where you voted all your dead people. You know.
Is that what they actually say? I mean, I've never. I mean, I didn't. I admit that I tried reading what. There's a little book that contains both the Edmund Burke's comments, reflections on the revolution in France, and Thomas Paine's response to that in The Rights of Man. And I found, even though I suppose that Edmund Burke deserves some status as a conservative philosopher and as bringing the issue of tradition and community and the bonds between humans in the face of capitalist change, I assume, from what I understand of his work, that he deserves some credit for being understood as a kind of Enlightenment philosopher in that sense. But it seems like in The Rights of Man, Thomas Paine just lays him to waste in his argument against just that sort of thing, that the past deserves a vote in the present.
Yeah.
To go back to the question of tax and the precarious state of Illinois finances, though, I would want to speak up in favor of the Illinois Constitution and its insistence on a flat tax on income. In terms of some comments you were making at our last session, David, which we've received compliments on the Facebook page for your discussion of Thomas Piketty and his book on
thanks to whoever made those comments.
Capital in the 21st Century. And you pointed out there that at the heart of Piketty's massive work is a suggestion that what's necessary is a tax on wealth,
absolutely,
not on income, and that wealth and income are different. I mean, if you tax something, you get less of it, eh? That's the theory, at least, behind cigarette taxes or taxes on gasoline for cut down driving and whatnot. If you tax income, you get less of it, perhaps, but what you want to tax is differential wealth. I mean, the money that people receive from whatever sources, work or investments or what have you, really have, there are a number of divisions and differences among them. First of all is the money you need to live, and I don't mean just the bare survival, but I mean the money that you spend when you live paycheck to paycheck, essentially, as most Americans do. Other money that comes in is different in terms of what it's applied to. If it's used to invest, to play the stock market, to buy an asset which will pay off down the road, and I'm not talking just about things that contribute to your lifestyle at the moment, but that distinction has to be insisted upon because one should be taxed and one shouldn't. The latter form of income should be taxed. Income that adds to your wealth should be taxed. Income that supports your life should not be, or at least it should be a low flat tax, in the sense that we're all in it together and everybody should contribute from each according to his means to each according to his needs. That's fine. But what happened here in this state was really quite interesting. Liberals proposed altering the Constitution, which takes, as you pointed out, a supermajority, and establishing a graduated income tax with the idea that this would get at some of the wealth by raising the upper rates of the list. Most people in the state looked at this and said, look, if they raise the upper rates, they're going to raise my rates too. Those expansions are going to run down the list, and as a result, there was very little support for the graduated income tax, except among certain ideological liberals. When it went down to defeat in the state legislature, it was Democrats who provided the essential votes to bring it down. It was not a case the Democrats were for it and the Republicans were against it. So the question is then, how do we go about taxing wealth? There are a number of problems in this regard, but I was impressed that the Speaker of the House came up with a way of getting at it. He suggested, okay, for education and other things, we need a certain amount of money. If we add a 3% tax on millionaires' income, that will produce the money. Now, in order to do that, it had to pass through a constitutional amendment the same way the income tax, the progressive income tax proposal did, and it failed too, also with the same Democrats voting against it. But it seems to me that the Speaker had it right within the limits he was working with. Tax the rich, tax millionaires, and use that money directly for the things that the state needs.
Well,
What's
we
wrong with
already
that?
do that indirectly in the property or real estate tax. And
No, that's not what Madigan proposed, though.
Well, right, I understand, but yeah.
He was talking about an income tax, which,
what
as
you're
I
suggesting is judged to be politically infeasible by a whole lot of people, and we'll have to get there slowly, incrementally, but they see no prospect of there ever being a tax on net worth, for example.
Well, no. There are two issues here. One is the tax not on net worth, but on investable assets, and so for the wealth taxes. And they're the sort of thing Piketty is suggesting, and that you're quite right. There are all sorts of difficulties within American law for that. I'm talking about the much more limited proposal that was offered as an alternative to the progressive income tax, and that was the millionaire's tax, which was in fact a tax on income, but only the income of millionaires.
Yeah, and even though, I mean, the response to Piketty's book in terms of a global wealth tax has been, well, how could this be politically feasible? But it's possible with what you're saying that it may be feasible at some local levels to have this kind of millionaire's tax. You know, it's more politically feasible to set the 99% off against the 1% than it is to set, you know, with this progressive or graduated tax, which really includes everyone and which confuses people in the middle who maybe end up being taxed more, along with even richer people being taxed even more. So, I mean, that could be done. I mean, that could be done in a fair way, for sure. But in an ironic way, it's not as politically feasible as just socking it to the 1%, which is certainly what should be done. You know,
the whole notion of politically feasible, I think, needs some examination. What politically feasible means in our country right now is, in fact, a situation that shows up the contradictions between capitalism and democracy. One of the uses of the term or of the phrase, that's not politically feasible, that strikes me as most important in the current discussion was the use of it by our next president, Hillary Clinton, who, when asked about single payer...
Uh-oh, you heard it first here.
Probably not, she did, but in any case. When Hillary was asked about, well, wouldn't she support single payer rather than, a Medicare for all, rather than the sort of gimcrack situations that we've got in this country right now under Obamacare, she said, well, yes, this was some years ago, yes, she said she'd support single payer, but it's not politically feasible. Now, she's right if we understand politically feasible means allowed by the rich people. There certainly was a popular movement in favor of single payer once people had it explained to them. That was carefully removed from the discussions about Obamacare before it took effect. Politically feasible means that those who control wealth and power in this country won't allow it. And that's exactly the same situation in regard to wealth taxes. As you say, wealth taxes are in the interest of the 99%, not in the interest of the 1%, and therefore they aren't politically feasible.
Yeah, that's what that word means. That's the precise meaning of that. It's not politically possible.
But, well, aren't we hearing more and more that the whole political system is under the control of the very rich, the oligarchs?
Well, the only people who don't believe that are people who belong to the political class, the top 20%, so to speak, in this country. 80% of Americans believe that and have believed it for years. And that's, I mean, that's what the polls show them.
Yeah, you can put yourself in a high moral position by advocating something as a solution to our problems that will very probably never come about. But
Yeah, let me just add in terms of the, I'm sort of obsessed with trying to get whatever data is available, including Piketty and others, to try to think about this. And as far as I was trying to make an argument in this article that I wrote about what the wealth really would be, and it looks to me, it's kind of rough and the data isn't always that great, but it looks to me that the 1% of richest families, of richest households in this state, which would be about 50,000 households, that 1% of all households in this state is probably approaching $1 trillion in total wealth, among them, and total wealth not including their houses. It may include other tangible items other than their houses. We've referred to the notion of investable assets before. This may be broader than investable assets or financial wealth per se, but it's got to be something like $1 trillion, $1,000 billion, what these 50,000 families are worth. And so 1,000 billion, 1% of 1,000 billion is 10 billion. That's what our state government needs to get out of its hole. It needs more than that, and it should have more than that. But that's it. That's one way of looking at it. 1% of what that 1% of what that 1% is worth without tax. Their houses are already taxed, and that's part of the regressive system in the state, which depends too much on property taxes, especially for schools, for the unequally funded schools that we've got.
Yeah. Well, you have to do something about the case of people with a high net worth, but very little income, such as farmers who may have very low income, but they're sitting
there
on
may be a little bit.
$1 million worth of property, and
well, yeah. I mean, if you just take businesses out of there, you've still got. Okay, so maybe you knock it down to a few $100 billion. There's plenty of money. People just need to understand how rich these people are, how much money they've got, and how unfair that system is in itself, and how silly it is, or how outrageous it is for state government to be piddling with a few $1 billion and everybody panicking about pensions and everything else. It's just unnecessary, and it's cooked.
Well, taxing wealth or investable assets and so on will create a set of problems of its own, but I think it may be worth doing anyway. I saw this film once about, apparently Japan had a wealth tax, and it was about this woman who was going around trying to discover the hidden assets of people so they could be taxed and so on, and the kind of situation that will lead to.
The only police I've ever seen on the streets in the city of Venice, Italy, are the Finanza, and they travel in pairs. These are cops. When I first saw them, I just thought they were standard cops that you saw in any city. Venice, for reasons that become obvious, and it doesn't have a lot of street crime. Drive-by shootings, for example, are difficult in Venice, and row-by shootings, maybe, I don't know.
But in any case, they don't have speedboats.
The police that you see are the financial police, those who are doing just what you described, Ron. They're going around looking for assets on which taxes have not been paid. Now, Italy has a great tradition of not paying taxes illegally, and the financial police are active as a result. But the question of finding assets to tax, it may produce some technical difficulties. We've got a long way to go before that's a serious issue. There have been, of course, wealth taxes in many countries. France and Switzerland both have wealth taxes, and they're usually so tiny that you don't notice at all. And this raises the parallel question that you've mentioned before, the need for a so-called Robin Hood tax, or a tax on financial transactions, also very tiny, but producing a great deal of money. Given the city of Chicago and the economic center that Illinois is, the ability of Illinois to levy a financial transactions tax, a so-called Tobin tax or a Robin Hood tax, would be certainly a step in the right direction.
Right. If you go on, if you Google investable assets of the 1% or wealth of the 1% or something along those lines, what you'll find out is there's an enormous amount of research being done by these hedge fund groups, equity funding groups, into what is called high asset, a class of high asset. There's levels of people making above $1 million, above $5 million, because these people want to know who's got the money to invest to attract them to their funds.
They want them as customers.
And so there's an enormous amount of data out there. It isn't,
Absolutely.
And it's fairly public at some levels. It isn't well organized unless you really take a lot of time. Piketty probably wants to get his hands on some of that.
Yeah.
But still, there is a lot now that is known about how much money these people have.
Banks and hedge funds and so forth don't seem to have too much difficulty of finding the people who are high income or high net worth individuals.
Net worth. That was the word I was looking for.
Right. That's Hinwees.
And I mean, you'll want to when you read some of the articles that are done by these hedge fund managers about this, sort of the research-based articles, you'll want to throw up, but I mean, because they're talking about it like they're not talking about it from critical terms. It's like, hey, let's get a hold of these people and sell them something, So that's the way it works.
One of the reasons these questions, I think, are on the table right now is that things have changed in recent years. I mean, over the last 40 years, say, the counterattack of neoliberalism in this country has produced a remarkable and accelerating concentration of wealth at the upper levels. This is, particularly since the crisis of 2007-8, the divisions between the very wealthy and the rest have grown apace, and what this means is that the concentration of wealth is not only increasing, it's accelerating. The concentration is becoming even more the case, and therefore people are saying, look, we've got to pay attention to a tax structure that allows that to happen, indeed encourages that to happen. And that's gotten even to the state legislature. Okay, but now there's time to do something about it.
Yeah. Another symptom of this, all the talk about tax rates and the poor corporations who have to pay such a high tax, 35% and so on. Do I have to point out again? That's totally phony.
Yeah.
They never actually pay that at all. Yeah. The typical rate is 10 to 12%.
Sure.
In actuality, and a lot of large corporations like GE manage to pay nothing at all, apparently, although they dispute that and claiming that you need to take a different view of things. Here's something on Newsmax, a right-wing website. Warren Buffett says talk of 35% corporate tax rate is a myth. That's totally phony. Yeah. When they start moaning about this, they talk only about the nominal rate and not what anyone actually pays, which is typically less than half of that.
But it would be, it would be rational for states not to compete in the corporate tax game.
Right.
They compete with each other. They, however collected, whatever effective rate it's actually collected at, it would be much better if there was simply a national. There is a federal corporate tax. It would be good if the states just got rid of theirs. The federal, figured out in the context of other things what would be a fair corporate tax rate, collected at a decent effective level without all these loopholes, and spread that money around back to the states. Would it have to be
global? I mean, we're hearing all this talk about corporations
moving
out of the USA.
Sure, but I mean, let's dream about that.
Right.
But it's less of a dream than it's probably more feasible than a global wealth tax, because corporations are global.
Yes.
I mean, they are multinational. There should be a global government regulating those things. I don't mean the IMF or the WTO or the UN. I mean something that actually represents the interests of the the 7 billion, not of the
Couldn't
few
you
million.
couldn't you make an argument? I mean, I think your point about that states should not be in the business of competing to attract businesses on the grounds that they'll give them a better deal on
Right.
taxes. So that's absolutely wrong.
Yeah.
But couldn't you make an argument that taxes on corporations, business taxes, in fact, could be abolished entirely?
They could, absolutely.
Given a wealth tax.
Yeah.
What you do
Absolutely.
then is take the wealth of General Motors or General Electric or
Yeah.
whoever and write it
Yeah.
down, as it were, to the individuals
Yeah.
who own that company and tax their wealth. Tax the wealth of the company as it
Yeah.
is divided among its owners. That way, in fact, you could take seriously the notion that if you tax something, you get less of it, with the notion that taxing businesses is not good for business.
Yeah.
Okay,
No,
fine.
there's
Let it
other
go.
ways of collecting that money, and liberals and progressives and well-intended people shouldn't necessarily be married to the idea that there should be a corporate tax. It's just a matter of at which level of the process do you get the money? What's the best way to get the money, whether it's from income or corporations or wealth? What's the most efficient and most fair way to get that at a broad level without allowing states to be played off against each other, counties to be played off, or countries to be played off against each other, for that matter.
Yeah. People have misconceptions about this. Warren Buffett points out, according to this, over the last decade, corporate tax rates have fallen while profits have risen. The interesting thing about the corporate rate is the corporate profits as a percentage of GDP over the last year were the highest, or just about the highest in the last 50 years, at over 10% of GDP, Buffett says. That's higher than we've seen in 50 years. At the same time, what's going on in the beautiful city of Champaign, DS Volition video game developers are requesting $200,000 from the city so they will stay downtown.
Sure.
Practicing a little extortion there.
Well, but look, suppose if you're one of the city fathers in Champaign, or mothers, and you look at this.
I think there's more mothers these days.
Well, it depends upon your opinion of them, I guess. But still, it's.
Well, mothers.
Yeah, exactly. The question is, well, a company like this, which is an employer, what do they have? 200 employees? I don't know.
Yeah.
They say, okay,
Absolutely.
well, we can't do business under these conditions. Therefore, unless you do something for us, we're going to have to go. We'll move or we'll close.
Absolutely.
And if you're in charge of the city's economic health, if you've been elected to do something about that, you say, well, look, let's see what we can do to keep this major employer here. The situation is corrupt at the base. It's not the decisions of the individual aldermen, because their situation is defined.
Yeah.
And
Well, we've had the same kind of handouts apparently to Kraft and to Yahoo,
Sure. Yep.
and so on. Where does it stop?
Yeah, well, it won't stop. I mean, the forces of concentrated wealth benefit from a highly complicated, multi-level system. There's plenty of room for confusion, evasion, and so forth, and it keeps people sort of talking about, sort of asking the wrong questions, really not being able to get a handle on how the whole system works.
And we'll see your comment on this, at least in a concise form.
Yeah, this week, yes, yes, that'll be a challenge.
Good. You've been watching news from Neptune for the 18th week of 2014, an Obama Revenge edition on the anniversary of the murder of Osama bin Laden by the U.S. Special Forces. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been David Green and Ron Szoke. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and see our Facebook page. We've got a number of interesting comments recently on the Facebook page, and we are happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. And we want to remind you of the demonstration in downtown Champaign tomorrow afternoon from 2 to 4 p.m. Against the war, against the ongoing war-making of the Obama administration. The demonstration is the regular monthly demonstration of the local anti-war, anti-racism effort. That's 2 to 4 p.m. at Main and Neal Streets in Champaign tomorrow afternoon. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and mine is charge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.